to be here with all of you today. I hope that really you're going to enjoy the talk. My name is Jair Torres, and I'm an international consultant, notably on sustainability, adaptation, and resilience. I actually a consultant for the UNDRR, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction for the Americas and the Caribbean, as well as from UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And today, Diego has told me about the possibility to talk to you a little bit about, some challenges and opportunities of early warning systems, notably on the multi-hazard early warning systems. So the idea today is I'm gonna start setting the context a little bit about how risk is now changing the perception of risk that we have. Now, in that risk perception way that we are now analyzing how the multi-hazard early warning systems start entering in that context of the new vision of risk. And then we're going to finalize discussing about a specific early warning system, that is that one for earthquakes, because that analyzing this specific hazard early warning systems, we can understand many of the elements that make some challenge and some opportunities for early warning systems. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Please, I don't have any issue if you raise your hand. If you have any questions, please do it. The idea is that this could be as much interactive as possible. If there is something that you don't understand because of my terrible accent, or if there is something that you would like to mention, please, let's make this really, really interactive, and let's take advantage that we are only few people here together. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen like that. You will be able to see my presentation. So everybody can see it? Good. Great. So I'm gonna, okay. So as I said, we're gonna be discussing today about the challenges and opportunities of multi-hazard early warning systems. This is in the framework of the Crisis and Disaster Management course of your University of Central Missouri. As I mentioned, my name is Jair Torres, and this is my company, the SAR Global Consulting. So I'm gonna start with setting the context. As you will see, one of the issues that we have been realizing nowadays came with COVID-19. COVID-19 was one of the major waking calls that we have in recent years, and notably in the United States after Hurricane Katrina, that has been one of the biggest issues that we have been facing nowadays. And that is coming back with the economic recession that we have seen in many countries, that is considered one of the social hazards that we are facing. And then we have a bigger challenge, that is the challenge of climate change, that now we cannot avoid it and is there. We have seen, for instance, how the prices are increasing, inflation is increasing in the United States, but also in all of the places of the world due to the negative impacts that climate change has brought. So, for instance, many droughts, many floods, and making that agricultural production will be really jeopardized, and for that reason having the negative consequence. So this in a context that we really need to try to understand the risk. So in order to understand the risk, the first thing that we need to do is to understand our planet. And in order to understand our planet, we need to understand that the planet is a youth planet that is in constant evolution. And we can see how, for instance, from the Pangea until now, the continent has been moving, and that has been generating different natural processes like seismicity, like changes in the temperature, like changes in the geomorphology of countries, etc., etc. And that understanding how the planet evolves needs also to make an understanding about how societies create risk, because the normal evolution of the planet will not create risk by itself, or can create some kind of risk, but not only for the planet itself, but not to the societies. So I love to present this image, because that image let us know how, in the way how societies and humans, we interact with nature, we are in a way creating some kind of risk. So for instance, in the part up of the image, we see how the floods in normal periods of there is not rainy seasons, they have the same kind of way. So the rivers, we say always that the rivers take the space that they normally deserve. And when we start controlling these issues, that is the image of down, and we say, okay, we're gonna canalize the river, and then we're gonna put houses and everything, when the normal evolution of the year interact with that is how the societies create risk. So we need to understand that in the beginning. So we have also trying to understand how just 1 minute. Oh, just 1 minute. So now we are understanding what are the hazards that we are facing. So we have hazards that come from societal systems, like those that are society, like was mentioned, for instance, now the economic crisis, conflict crisis, technological, for instance, the nuclear, but also those that are created, those hazards that are created naturally, like extraterrestrial. So the case, for instance, of the asteroids that can impact the Earth, or the meteorological and hydrological, when we're talking about hurricanes and typhoons, biological, like any kind of virus, environmental, like the salinization of the land. So we say how the environment itself produces some kind of hazards that societies need to face, geological, like earthquakes that we know. So the thing is that when the interaction of societies, so between the interaction of social and natural systems, we are in a way trying to denaturing hazards. And this is why, for instance, on the chemical hazards, we can be having some risks that are related to chemical, but that have the influence of men. This is what we call, the anthropogenic part of the hazards. Extraterrestrials, before we say like, oh no, nothing could happen, but now we have an enormous quantity of satellite pollution that if one of the satellites can fall in the air, can create a lot of issues, like death, can create economic losses, etc., etc. Meteorological, hydrological, but we see climate change. And climate change is one of the ways how we are in a way denaturing the hazards, how we are creating an increase on frequency, on impacts, on temporality of the normal weather that we normally expect. And biological, for instance, COVID-19. COVID-19, we mentioned how, in the way how we have been reducing the way or the protections that different species have between one to another one, and we are combining species that before were not getting together. This is in a way how we are creating new viruses that are coming to one of the issues that we need to get attention because we are getting exposed to there. Environmental, like oil spill, and geological, something that you have seen in the United States recently, that is the fracking, and how fracking technology is creating more seismicity in some of the states in the United States. So, and this combined with the vulnerability and the exposure, and normally the underlying drivers of risk like poverty, inequality, corruption, this is what we now mention about the systemic nature of risk, about how the risks are really systemic and are not separated one to each other, but they can compound in one to another one, they can cascade, they can generate more crises, etc., etc. And this is what we are living today. So when we talk about the changing the understanding of risk, we normally have understand risk, about in this concept of the typical equation that risk is equal to hazard multiplied by vulnerabilities, human and physical, and multiplied to the exposure that these physical and social vulnerabilities have to a specific hazard. And that normally what we do is we reduce that by the capacities that each individual and this society, but also each infrastructure will have to cope with that specific hazard that we have. And this is how we evaluate risk. And risk normally we say that we have been mentioned risk as an element that can jeopardize development, that can jeopardize sustainable development, that can jeopardize economic growth, that can jeopardize human development, etc., etc. And we have been understanding traditionally this risk based on the cycle, that we have an event, we respond to that event, we recovered from that event, then we develop all of the activities for mitigation, and then we prepare for the next event. And this is how we have understood the disaster management cycle. But now we understand that development choices by themselves, they create new risk. So what we need to do in a way is to put risk at the core of the development. Those elements that we select as elements for the pathways of development can put us in more risk. Climate change is one of the examples of this. So, we took in the 60s a political decision to base most of the world economies on fossil energies. And that economic choice that different countries had has put the interaction of new risks that are being more evident with climate change. We have more intensive and extensive risk layers, and now we need to change this understanding of risk to the development as risk that the development produced by itself. So we need to do some prospective disaster risk management, that is to prevent and avoid the creation of new risks. We need to do compensatory disaster risk management, that is more about strengthening social and economic resilience. And we need to do corrective disaster management, that is more about reducing the existing risks that we have in our societies. And this goes to another understanding on which when we are evolving from a traditional equation of risk that, as I mentioned before, like vulnerability, hazard, and exposure, to one more holistic understanding on which when we combine the different hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, but with global, national, subnational, and local elements that interact with different categories at the human, ecological, economic, infrastructure, and political level. So it's trying to understand the systemic nature of risk and how these interconnections between, for instance, the national economy with the exposure of specific assets or credits or loans, and then with the vulnerability to specific ecological systems, how these interactions are created, and how we can see that elements that we think that will not affect us will affect us at the end. And this is one of the big examples, for instance, with the COVID. We started saying like, there is a virus that started in China. We are very far from that. So how is going to impact me, that specific issues? And now with interconnectors, so we have these kind of issues that not only affect the health aspects, that this is what we were, at the beginning thinking like, okay, with the COVID, we want to be, with health issues, but how the health issues or the health crisis also impacted the economy, also impacted the social conditions of people, also create new vulnerabilities, create new risks, and create other failures in other parts of our systems. So, as I mentioned, there is a changing understanding of risk. And for instance, the IPCC report that was launched last September 2020, and the new IPCC report that was launched like 15 days ago already tell us that, we need to foresee risk not only as the adverse consequence for humans, but also to ecological systems. Because if we don't understand the impacts that these different elements can have on humans and ecological systems, we are missing part of the picture about how risk is being created. And in this context, it is important that climate change, in the context of climate change, it's important that to understand that risk can arise from potential impacts of climate change as well as human responses to climate change. So it's not only on the way how we adapt and mitigate climate change, but in the way how these repercussions of the actions that we do can create new systems, so the avoiding of the new risks that we are presenting. And this is the last figure that was created by the IPCC report, which I recommend that you take a look, and that was published like 15 days ago. So what it's saying is that we have main interactions and trends that are happening nowadays, notably on the climate change, on ecosystems, including the biodiversity, and on human society, and how these interactions between emissions, between maladaptations, between impacts, between the way how we adapt and the way that the impacts of climate change come to ecosystems and human society, and the way how we restore and conserve and how we make a provision and livelihood for ecosystem services is the only way how we can understand risk at the center of this. The idea is that with urgent actions, notably on governance, on finance, on knowledge and capacity, on catalyzing conditions and technologies, we can really go to a future where we limit global warming to the levels that are expected, so 1.5 degrees, and on which one we really do adaptations and mitigation for future climate change by reducing the impacts that we're going to have on the human and the ecosystems and in the ecosystems transitions. So it's very important I wanted to start this presentation with this understanding, because climate change is getting very, very much as one of the drivers of disaster risk. And disaster risk as well is creating a lot of drivers for climate change. When we misadapt, when we mismitigate or when we do development choices that are not part of the whole context that we need. So it's in this context that multi-hazard early warning systems comes. So if you see the 2030 agenda, which I believe everybody is very familiar to that, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the adaptation agenda that is based on the Paris Agreement, and we have the resilience agenda that is based on the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And those three agendas, that is the climate change adaptation, the sustainable development, the disaster risk reduction, put at the center the creation of resilience. So reducing the vulnerability and enhancing resilience. Not saying that vulnerability is the other side of the coin of the resilience, but saying that in order to really reach resilience, it is very important to reduce vulnerability and to reduce the underlying factors of risk. And in the 2030 agenda, for instance, there is already a specific goal, that is goal 11, that calls us about make cities and human settlements sure, inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And that includes that communities, cities in general, will have specific systems that will allow them to take actions when an emergency comes. But the most important, not only to have those systems that make you to take actions at the moment they come, but that cities will really reduce as maximum all of the potential risks that they can generate. I don't know if you saw the other day in Japan, it was an earthquake of 7.3. Number of casualties, 0. Number of economic losses, very limited and normally covered by insurance companies. Economy was reactivated in 30 minutes after the earthquake. Please remember that the earthquake in Haiti, that was of less intensity at 7.1, destroyed completely the country, killed more than 350,000 people. So here is an example that is telling us why the hazard is not the importance, it's about how we prepare, mitigate, and adapt to the different elements, what really creates disaster risk reduction and resilience. It's not about the hazards, it's about the societal capacities that we will create to cope with that. And this is why it's important, more than be prepared for the emergency, it's important to reduce the risk in order that we don't need to put much funding and resources on the emergencies. And this is what the Sustainable Development Goal 11 is telling us, together with the Sendai framework. The Sendai framework says, like, look, we need to work together in an all hazards approach, really to reduce the mortality, to reduce the affected people, to reduce the economic losses, to reduce the damage to critical infrastructure and basic services like health or like education. And how we do that? By increasing countries with national and local strategies. So knowing that countries has a plan and a strategy to really improve these elements of resilience, to international cooperation, and of course to the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessment. That this is where the multi-hazard early warning systems element come into context. I'm really sorry, I'm gonna take out my sweater because it's very hot here. So I continue with that. So a part of the Sustainable Development Goals, a part of the Sendai framework, we have also the Paris Agreement that is also calling for early warning systems and is telling us that we need to strengthen the scientific knowledge on climate, of course, but to include research and systematic observation of the climate systems and early warning systems in a manner that informs climate services and supports decision making. So we are putting early warning systems and multi-hazard early warning systems at the core of the main 2030 agenda as one of the elements on which we will need to reduce the risk, and when the emergency comes, we will need to be able to take actions in order to reduce that the hazard impact became in a disaster. So when we are talking about early warning systems, so we need to go beyond the narrower understanding of early warning systems. So what is that narrower understanding of early warning systems? That narrow understanding of early warning system, it means that it's a technical view that only comprise the technical equipment that will help us to detect or forecast a hazard event and sending its parameters to a decision-making authority. This is the really narrow understanding. So it's about the equipment material that we will have to use in order that we can really monitor and understand how we can forecast the different elements of a specific hazard. And we need to pass from that narrower understanding of early warning systems to a wider understanding of what early warning system means. And early warning systems are actually social processes that involves, of course, the technical components, but that are embedded in their social context. And here we are passing from a technical view about what early warning systems are to a disaster risk management approach in which one early warning systems plays a role. And why you will say these things? Because, you know, in a way, we have been realizing that in certain cultures, for instance, you can have the best system, you can have the best early warning systems, you can have the best way to communicate the warning to the people via SMS, via text message, via television, via radio, by any kind of broadcasting, but people don't take action. And why people don't take actions? Because there are social elements that make that people do not take actions, like cultural elements, like elements that are related to societal issues, inequality, poverty, cultures where there is a patriarchal culture on which when decisions are not taken without the men. So there are a lot of elements that need to take into consideration if we really want to make that early warning systems will be really used and effective in that sense. So when we are talking about early warning systems, we are talking about different elements. So we are mentioned that early warning systems is something that provides you lead time, you know, that is the early part, that provide the warning, so that means that give the possibility for decision-making process, not only by the authorities, but also by individuals about what I should do when I got the warning, and of the systems. That means that this is not something that comes without interactions, but this has a lot of flows and interactions, not only about the 4 elements of the early warning systems, but about the way how we respond to that. And what are these 4 elements? The first element is risk knowledge. So we need to know what are the different elements that create a hazard. So what are the hazards that we have in our communities, in our countries, in our states, and how we really collect data in order to better understand how these hazards could impact us, how that hazard impact the vulnerabilities, the existing vulnerabilities of the countries. What are the different patterns and factors that we need to take into consideration? We have risk maps, we have data available. So it's all of the understanding of the hazard itself is the first element of early warning systems, because without understanding the hazards, it's very difficult to monitor it. Then is the second element. We need to monitor and to provide a warning services. So that means that we need to develop hazard monitoring and early warning systems in order to determine which elements or which parameters we're going to be monitoring. You know, the change in the temperature, the change on the groundwater, the change on food productions, the change on different elements depending the specific hazards, if it's one of the cluster hazards or individual hazards. What is the scientific basis of making forecasts? So how we can determine when and how much time we will have before the hazard impact us. Can accurate and timely warnings be generated? So we have, like, for instance, for hurricanes that we can foresee for 3, 5, even a week in advance how the hazard is moving, and we can monitor when that specific hurricane is coming to a specific to a particular land. So all of these things is very important when we are monitoring and warning the services. The third element is the dissemination and communication. So how are we going to communicate this not only to individuals, to communities, but also to institutions that take actions when a specific hazard comes? So do warning reach all of those at risk? Are we sure that when we have a warning, everybody will receive it? People with disabilities, people that are deaf, for instance, they can hear if we have big speakers that are telling you to move from the coastal area in the case of a tsunami. Is the warning information clear and usable? So how are we going to disseminate the message without confusing and generating more panic? And what are the channels that we're going to create for disseminating this? As I mentioned before, by SMS, text message, TV, radio, etc., etc. And the 4 elements, and where we have the biggest challenge, is in improving the response capability of individual communities and institutions. In order to do that, we need to try to make as much as possible people to understand what are the different warnings that they will receive and how they need to act for each of the elements. If there is for a tsunami, they know that they will need to run to the higher place or far from the coastal area. If there is an earthquake, so they need to understand that they need to know how much time they will have in order to, to hold, protect themselves and hold themselves if there is a flash flood or if it's a hurricane. So there are different capacities that are measured depending the hazards that will impact that people. And those capacities are only improved if we really create plans that are up to date and tested. If we create local capacities and knowledge to use that plans, to use the techniques, to read the information and to apply that information so that people be prepared and ready to react to warning. So this is the 4 elements of early warning systems, and this is the key elements of what we want. That early warning systems provide a leading time, a decision-making process, and a flow of interactions, and that are end-to-end. So that means that it starts with the knowledge of the risk and finish with the action that needs to be taken by the individual, community, or institution. And that are people-centered. It's not only about having the system, but without thinking about the people. So these are the 2 big elements of that: end-to-end, people-centered. And there are the 4 elements in order to create early warning systems: risk knowledge, monitoring and warning service, dissemination and communication, and response capabilities. So what we say on this, we say, like, look, there is a need at the governance level when we are developing early warning systems that will be the coordinations that will create this coherence agenda between the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework. And that means that we need to work with different sectors and with different communities and scientific communities and with the private sector and with government institutions and with civil society organizations and indigenous people and local communities in order to really putting at the center the human ecological systems and trying to see how the different interactions between the different plants can really create a space that will help us to understand the hazard, monitor the hazard, disseminate and communicate, and create response capabilities. And this is why, for instance, it is very important to try to understand what are the sectorial plans on telecommunications and information systems, on water and sanitations, on health, on education, on the national strategies for disaster risk reduction and adaptation plans, and how early warning systems are incorporating without these plans in different sectors. And not only at the national level, but also at the subnational level and at the local level. And of course, in interaction with the global level on which one a lot of coordination is happening here. So, saying this, and before to pass to the early warning systems study case, I want to tell you, because sometimes there is the big question about, when we are talking about multi-hazard early warning systems, are we talking about an individual system that will generate all the warnings to all the body? No, because every single hazard have different capacities for understanding and different capacities for monitoring. It's not the same to understand a seismicity that understand hunger for early warning, or to understand hurricanes. It's different organizations, different institutions, different scientific methods in order to understand the hazard and to monitor it. But there are elements on the different early warning systems that can be compatible and that we can use together with a multi-hazard approach. So when we are talking about the multi-hazard approach, is to try to understand how individual and cluster hazards early warning systems can get some synergies in the way how they communicate, or in the way how they improve the response capabilities, and also in the way how, through different equipments that we have, we can monitor more than one hazard. For instance, when we are monitoring tsunamis, as you know, tsunamis, so 90% of the tsunamis are triggered by seismicity. So if a tsunami is triggered by seismicity, if I'm already monitoring earthquakes, I can provide information to the tsunami. So this is where we talk to have a multi-hazard approach. It's not that it's only one system providing early warning systems for all of the hazards, but it's to have a different systems that have an understanding about the synergies that can be developed on the 4 elements of early warning systems, and that can be applied to the societies, to the communication, to the monitoring and to the understanding of the hazards. And here is what I want to finish with the earthquake warning, with the earthquake early warning systems study case. So I don't know for all of you if you are aware about what is these earthquake early warning systems and how they are created, but earthquake early warning systems is not earthquake prediction. So as you know, earthquakes, we cannot have prediction itself. And when we are talking about prediction, we are talking about the precise information about the timing, location, and size of a future earthquake. It is impossible nowadays that somebody can say, look at on 15 April at 3 o'clock in the epicenter of, in Missouri as an epicenter, we're gonna have an earthquake of 4.5 in the Richter scale. So this is impossible. No, that is impossible. If somebody tells you that, you know, you say, look at, you're telling not the truth. It's not earthquake forecasting. So forecasting is more about how you see like the weather forecast, you know, like the probability that this will happen. So it's a probability about timing, location, and size of future earthquakes. On that, the science has advanced a lot. But remember, that as I mentioned in the first slide, you know, the Earth is a planet that is in constant evolution and interactions, but it's also a chaotic system. And trying to understand the cause of that system is what seismologists, geologists, and earthquake engineers have been trying to do since the last 50 years. And this has bring us to some kind of understanding about that, what are the triggers that can create some seismicity in a specific area. So for instance, they are talking about the temperature, the underground temperature. They're talking about changes in the atmospheric pressure. They're talking about different triggers that when they are combined can create the condition necessary or reflect how the air is moving in their plates, and that can create a specific earthquake. So forecasting now is being used notably in China, notably in parts of the United States. There are some people working on some papers. Russian as well, the Russia Federation is working on this, but still forecasting is a real science that will need more improvements in order that we can have forecasting as we have for the weather or for the climate related hazards. So when we are talking about earthquake early warning systems, we are talking about the time that we will have when the earthquake is still rupturing. And why is this possible? This is possible because, as you know, earthquakes are creating with two different waves. So earthquakes are a liberation of energy, and that liberation of energy is produced by two waves, what we call the primary wave, that really travels at approximately 6.5 kilometers per second, and that really are those that arrive the first to those monitoring instruments. So they are, let's say, they are these kind of waves like when you drop a stone on the water and you see the water how it goes in waves. So they are there is not a lot of amplitude. So for that reasons, they go faster in the fires. They go faster and they are detected faster. There are, for instance, those that animals can perceive. Some animals can perceive this specific primary wave. And of course, the seismic monitoring instruments can perceive it. The second waves are those that are more, you know, like an electrocardiogram. And they travel with approximately 3.5 kilometers per second and arrive after the P wave. So the difference between the P wave and the S wave is what can create these possibilities to provide a warning system. So for instance, this is the scenario of the shake alert that the people of the University of Berkeley is using for providing earthquake early warning systems in all of the west coast of the United States and Canada. So you have the fault, you have the epicenter, you have the first wave, so you have the sensors that get the first wave, and then in the triangulations with different sensors, for instance, with this one, this one, this one, this one, they can understand what is the time that the destructive wave, that is the secondary wave, will have to come to where we are expecting to protect people, industry, etc. Depending where the epicenter is, and depending where the sensors are, and depending the distance for the the city or the community that we would like to protect, we will have between 1 second to 180 seconds, depending that. For instance, the city of Mexico could have until 120 seconds, but the city of Istanbul now maximum can get 7 seconds. And then you're gonna say like, oh, wow, what I can do in 7 seconds. Well, this is what we're gonna discuss now on the response capabilities. So what are the types of applications? So the applications of any early warning systems, when there are with very short period, is the first one is personal safety, so that people can move to a safe zone. The second is situational awareness, so that those that are that needs to start with the response can have the information about where is the location, where is going to be the biggest impact, and start implementing the standard operation protocols in a timely manner, avoiding that the telecommunications will collapse. And the third one, for earthquakes, and specifically for earthquakes, but this is something that we are now seeing more and more in advance for other hazards like climate-related hazards, is for automated control, slowing, stopping, isolating sensitive systems. I'm going to go on that, and I'm going to give you examples out of the seismic, out of the earthquake, and I'm going to go with the hydrological hazards. So, for instance, for personal safety, what we need to do is to identify a safe zone. So what we are trying to do is, when we provide an early warning, is that people will be mentally prepared for the check-in, that they protect from failing bookshelves, from lighting, etc., for things that can fall on their head. If they are at home or at office, to be under a study table. If they are outside, so away from machinery or falling hazards, plants that people can put on the windows, etc., etc. And, for people that are in industrial plants, construction sites, to be away from machinery and chemicals. Situational awareness, as I mentioned, is to initiating the emergency response before the communications are lost. So that means that all of the people that are in charge of responding to the crisis already understands where they need to go. Who are the different elements that they will need to take into consideration? How many people could be affected? So to get all of this information, so normally if you have all of this data that you have been calibrated at the beginning, where you have the hazard information, you already know that if this specific part of the country or of the city will be impacted due to the specific earthquake, so you know already where you're going to address the ambulance, where you're going to address the firefighters, where you're going to address the rescue teams, etc., etc. So provide you all of the situational awareness that you need in order to respond to the crisis. And the third one is about the automated control. And this is something on which one I'm going to provide you many examples, because it's something on which one the technology is really going very fast. And you that will be going to be working on crisis and management and really on reducing risk need to try to understand how you combine this technology with policy, how you link science and technology with policy development, and what could be the complications there. So on the automated control, what we want to do is to bring in systems into a safe mode. So preventing cascading failures, slowing, stopping, or rerouting. So for instance, that is depending the level of complexity. It's not the same to turn off a nuclear plant that, that to close a shop that doesn't have any chemicals or anything. And the idea is that we can have different elements on which we will have, for instance, smart buildings, putting sensitive equipment into stable or saving data, for instance, in Silicon Valley, where it's very important to save data, or for instance, in Wall Street, where they don't have so much seismicity there, but that they can collect all the data and save data and process. Trains that can slow down power, that can put as a second, like an alternative power, communications. We can say to airplanes to go around, to not to go at the airport when the airport is happening, isolating hazardous chemical and machinery, pipelines, oil and gas, refinery, nuclear plants, etc., etc. And in order to reduce the level of complexity, we need to integrate earthquake early warning systems with other technologies that will help us to monitoring the systems and provide the necessary instrumentations. What are the different limitations and perspectives in the case of a specific earthquake early warning systems. For instance, the first one is the false on run alerts. This is something that is new, has been starting since the late 90s in the areas of the west coast of the United States, in Mexico, in Japan. So this is not something that we are monitoring and that we are improving very fast. There are the warning and blind zones. So if you are on the fault, but your time is very, very limited, as I explained before. And the other thing is the lack of early warning education. So the possibility that when you launch a warning, people will panic. And this is what is very important to understand, that the false and run alerts are really going down when we are improving seismic data. And when we are really understanding better the hazard, and when we monitoring better, we reduce the possibility of the false alerts. For the warning in blind zones, now we have new technologies like the 5G that really is improving how communication goes from one side to another one, and we can be winning and earning some value seconds by the provision of early warning systems, as we can see here. So we have accelerations that, due to new machinery and new seismic detectors, plus the technology of telecommunications, can really reduce the time, can improve the time of providing the warning and reduce that limitations that we have if we are in the blind zone. And the lack of early warning systems, for instance, you have seen this with the get ready to check out that are, for instance, utilized in the California state. So it's about how we communicate to the people and explain to the people what to do. So some elements about that. So we talk about nuclear plants, we talk about machinery. So I'm going to tell you about some real plants that are happening nowadays. So in 2008, it was presented this model in order to protect really the Michelangelo, the David, the Michelangelo that is in Italy. So they create a system that now they are implementing in Florence, on which one that when the earthquake comes, the automatic engineering system will protect the sculptures and avoid that the sculptures will fall. And as you will see, in the middle, in the right is what they are trying to protect, in the left is the way how they protect it, and in the center is how the David will be protected when the earthquake wave comes, so you can protect the cultural part of Italy on that. Public applications that we have today for earthquake early warning systems, bullet trains. So for instance, in the Tohoku earthquakes and tsunami that came afterwards, 24 trains were running in the line between the Tohoku Shinkansen system, that is the Tokyo to the north of the country. They have sensors around the whole stations, and as soon as they understood that the earthquake was coming, they start shut down the power and making that people slowing down the trains and stopping in the next station. So that avoid, for instance, that trains will be out of the rail and creating what we call the cascade effects of the earthquake. Sometimes earthquakes, we always say that earthquakes don't kill, what kill is the buildings, or all of the cascade effects that come after the earthquake, like the derailing of trains, like the fires that are produced, etc., etc. And another public application is the metro in San Francisco. The Bay Area Rapid Transit is using earthquake early warning systems, and in the case of a specific earthquake in the Bay of San Francisco, the metro will open the doors in the next station and make that everybody go out of the train or stay in the train, but avoid that the train will be running when the earthquake is happening. Private applications. There are private applications that are being developed and that has been very effective. There is the story of Oki Engineering that is located on the Miyagi Prefecture in Japan, and they produce a lot of chips. It's one of the biggest enterprises of chips in Japan. And in 2003, they have two damaging earthquakes on which one their losses were more than $50 million in losses due to the cascade effect of the earthquakes, the fires, the equipment damage, the loss of productivity, the orders that they couldn't deliver, all of the legal elements that come before. So after that, they understood that the Japan Meteorological Agency has been working on a system in order to provide a warning when earthquake was coming. It was not open at the public at that moment in Japan in 2003. And they spent $600K on early warning system and shear walls in basement in order to protect, really to protect the equipment that is the most valuable for them, to protect all of the machinery, to put it, that were exposed in areas where it's not going to be exposed, and to save data and to save processes. After they expand this in 2008, 2006, 2008, they have two similar earthquakes, and their losses were reduced from 15 million to 200,000. And the productivity was reduced, the loss of productivity was reduced from 17 to 13 days loss to 4.5 to 3.5 days of loss of productivity. And when you have this kind of losses, it's very easy that the insurance company will pay to you. But when you have 50 million in losses, that is more complicated that these things will come. So this is some public-private applications that we can have. Chevron as well in San Francisco Bay is applying these technologies in order to have different elements when an earthquake will come there. In China, it's very well applied in the different areas after the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. They started applying more, and they have now a lot of private companies that are using these systems to protect any fire or any explosion, not only the gas company of Chengdu, the petrochemical company, the paint company, etc., etc. In Istanbul, that is a public system, the Istanbul Natural Gas Distribution Corporation, they have this big pipeline of more than 9 kilometers, about 10 kilometers in the city of Istanbul. But they have from the pipeline from when they get the gas is more than 9,000 kilometers, and they get different regulators at the community level that are this what we call the service boxes. So in order that to protect, in Istanbul, they have decided that they will not provide the warning to the people because they have only 7 seconds. But in these 7 seconds, they can really shut off some mechanisms in order to avoid that if there is a rupture on the gas line, they can create explosion and that the people will be, affected by these explosions. So the Berkeley University for the United States has estimated that the operation of earthquake early warning systems will cost around $16 million per year. But they have also estimated the potential losses that a specific earthquake will generate in the state of California. So they say only on a statistical life, so that is based on insurance, on life insurance, there are 6.6 million that only for the region of California, for a specific earthquake that they simulate, there will be claims for 6.6 million of insurance life. They will avoid, for instance, the Oki. They replicate the Oki example of the manufacturer to California. They say we're going to avoid 7.5 of only one industry. The fire damage prevented will be about more than 31 million based on the Hayward scenario that they have created. Only by reducing the possibility that one car of the BART trains will be damaged, we are reducing $33 million. So we see a lot of benefits of implementing these specific systems, not only in the United States, but all around the world. So what is the way forward? The way forward is to ensure the inclusion of earthquake early warning systems and related technologies on national and local policies and plans, as well as to improve the seismic data information. So in a way is how when we understand about how we can reduce the impact of the hazard and how we can reduce the crisis, we need to work as people that are working on emergency response and everything. We need to work with policymakers in order to reduce the risk and to create not only earthquake, but other early warning systems in the national plans in order that they have the necessary money, the necessary budget in order that they can implement this. So being on crisis management is not only about how I will respond to the crisis or to the emergency, but also how I can influence policymakers to reduce the risk in order that the emergency management will be less than if we don't reduce the risk. We need to improve the understanding of the benefits and limitations of any kind of early warning systems, and we need to inform and provide transparency to the general public. We need to know what are the challenges, what are the limitations, what we know about the hazard, what we don't know about the hazards. This is one of the big issues that we have learned, for instance, from COVID. The uncertainty that we were living with COVID, it was something that was not very well communicated to many individuals and communities worldwide. And this is why we criticize a lot different governments around the world, because that was not transparency about the uncertainty that we have. You know, politicians don't like to say in public that they don't know, but we need to communicate to people the things that we don't know, the things that we know, and the things that maybe we don't know that we don't know. And this is something that is very important when we are trying or working with early warning systems, because transparency is what will bring that the response capabilities will be increased. And then we need to strengthen the institutional, private sector, academia, and general public capacities for early warning systems in order to make this more informal in plans, in policies, and in budget allocations. So this is, for instance, in the case of Mexico, how they are integrated. But with this, I wanted to finish my presentation and to talk a little bit about multi-hazard early warning systems and about the specific example of earthquakes and the need to really to work as a system, not only as individuals that are in face of something specific, but as a system with other people, with other disciplines, with policymakers, in order that we can reduce the impact of hazards and make that hazards don't become disasters. This is why we say that disasters are not natural. If you hear people saying natural disasters, say like, disasters are not natural. What are natural is the hazards. Disasters happens when we don't have the capacity really to cope with that specific hazards, and this is why I mentioned the case of Japan. So thank you for your attention. I hope that you have get the whole picture about what I wanted to transmit to you. I guess that we have